under the white glow of floating sigils and account lights. The world of Veyra Prime looked less like a city and more like a machine that had learned how to wear beauty. Towers of polished metal curved into the clouds like silver reeds. Bridges of transparent crystal carried silent traffic over markets where entire lives were valued, measured, and transferred with a gesture. Names were traded there. Debts were inherited there. Bloodlines could be audited, downgraded, or erased there. Every transaction was recorded by the contract lattice, a legal web so old and sacred that even governors feared crossing it. On Veyra Prime, law was not a shield. It was a blade sharpened into ceremony. Labor contracts hung beside memory licenses. Gene rights scrolled above family auctions. Penal service terms blinked over chained figures displayed as calmly as freight. To outsiders, it all seemed orderly. To Jonah Vale, it looked like slavery taught to speak in clean language and expensive light. Jonah had not come to save anyone. He had come for work. His cargo hauler, weathered and stubborn like its captain, sat in a licensed docking cradle above the city while he moved through customs with a salvage case in one hand and a packet of transit permits in the other. He was there to close a routine deal involving engine cores, disputed freight, and a debtor registry that only Veyra Prime could legally untangle. He knew worlds like this in broad strokes. Every major trade hub thought itself civilized because it hid cruelty under paperwork. He had survived enough border ports, syndicate docks, and war repair stations to recognize corruption in formal clothes. Still, Veyra Prime unsettled him more than rougher places ever had. There was no shouting here, no visible grime, no open brutality. That was exactly what made it ugly. Everything cruel had been refined, certified, and given elegant names that allowed the powerful to feel clean while they ruined lives. The city welcomed him with courtesy that barely concealed contempt. Humans were allowed, profitable even, but never fully respected. Too emotional, local guides said. Too impulsive. Too obsessed with individual conscience. The words were spoken with polite amusement, as if humanity were a species of dangerous children too useful to ban outright. Jonah answered the way he usually did, by pretending not to care. He signed what he had to sign, bribed who he had to bribe, and kept moving. Business first, morality later. That had been his rule for years, mostly because life in deep trade routes punished anyone foolish enough to challenge every injustice they saw. Then he entered the lower contract market and found a rule breaking inside him. The exchange hall spread beneath a cathedral dome of glass and living code. Shimmering legal threads drifted through the air like holy scripture, linking brokers, buyers, witnesses, and bound persons into glowing chains of verified ownership. Hundreds moved below in calm streams. Some came to purchase skilled labor. Some came to acquire debt claims. Some came to settle blood obligations between houses that had hated one another for generations. It all happened in perfect order. Nothing was hidden. That openness made Jonah's stomach tighten. A crime committed in secret could still pretend to be ashamed of itself. A crime performed as tradition had forgotten shame entirely. He passed gene bond counters, family claim booths, and memory lien tables where the poor sold years of recall to wealthy patrons who wanted temporary access to experience not their own. Then he saw the disposition ring at the center of the hall, and everyone around it watching with the stillness of people attending a respected ritual. She stood there under a suspended lattice of blue legal fire, restrained not by chains but by projected seals wrapped around her wrists, throat, and spine. She was alien in a way that made the eye linger without fully understanding why. Tall but drawn with exhaustion, with pale bronze skin marked by faint lines that seemed almost carved rather than grown, and eyes too bright to belong to someone so clearly battered. Dark hair fell in rough strands around a face that had forgotten how to ask for mercy. Her clothes were plain contract gray, but even ruined fabric could not fully hide the old elegance in the way she held herself. She did not bow. She did not plead. She looked at the buyers as if she hated them too much to waste fear on them. A rotating display above her listed categories instead of name. Contested lineage. penal debt inheritance, civic contamination, disposition pending final completion. Jonah stopped walking. Two brokers nearby whispered with the casual hunger of people discussing inventory. She had once belonged to a minor house. One said. Not minor, the other corrected, fallen. Dangerous blood. Politically inconvenient. There had been some scandal generations back, some legal purge, some issue with registry rights and ancient kinship claims. Most of her line was gone now. What remained had been reduced, resold, and folded into debt labor until even their history could be itemized. She was the last complicated piece, too expensive to rehabilitate, too symbolically awkward to leave unresolved. Completion was cheaper. The word sat badly in Jonah's mind. He asked the clerk what it meant, and the answer came with bureaucratic ease. Completion was the final legal closure of a defective personhood claim. Identity would be settled, disputed status removed, future ownership regularized, or, in some cases, terminally concluded according to standing code. Settled, removed, regularized. The language made him want to hit something. He told himself to keep moving. None of this was his business. Every spacer with a conscience learned the same bitter lesson eventually. If you tried to stop every machine that ate people, the machine would simply eat you next. He had contracts to finish, a ship payment due in 9 days, and a crew that depended on him staying practical. He took 3 steps away from the ring. Then the woman in gray lifted her head, and their eyes met for one hard second. There was no plea in her face. That was what stopped him. No desperate appeal for rescue. No dramatic suffering meant to hook the conscience of a passing stranger. Only contempt, grief burned dry, and a kind of exhausted defiance that said she already knew exactly what the universe was and hated it for being consistent. Jonah turned back. The bidding had already begun, though it hardly sounded like bidding. It was more like legal fencing. Numeric offers wrapped in status clauses. Usage restrictions. Liability transfers. Ritual rights. One buyer wanted labor extraction rights. Another wanted closed house leverage through possession of her disputed bloodline. A third, smiling in soft expensive silks, seemed to want her simply because owning a once noble being in public would announce power to the room. Jonah asked for the current price. When the number flashed into his slate, he almost laughed. It was obscene, far beyond the value of the job that had brought him here. Enough to cripple his operating margin for months. Enough to make any sane trader turn around and leave. He should have done exactly that. Instead, he heard himself submitting a purchase challenge. Heads turned. The broker's expression changed first to surprise, then amusement. A human? For this asset? The room began to reevaluate him instantly. Not as a trader anymore, but as a curiosity. Some assumed lust. Some assumed ignorance. Some assumed the uniquely reckless human habit of following private morality into public disaster. Jonah let them think what they liked. He raised the bid once, then again when one noble proxy tried to force him out, then a third time with money he absolutely should not have spent. On the final offer, silence spread across the ring. It was too much for casual interest and too irrational for strategy. The contract seals shifted color. Purchase recognized. Disposition transferred. The blue fire around the woman dimmed and reformed under his authorization mark. A clerk approached with ceremonial calm and placed the transfer rod into Jonah's palm. The legal heat of it bit his skin. Around the ring, whispers moved like insects through grass. The human had bought her. The human had actually done it. Some looked entertained. Others looked disgusted. 1 or 2 looked suddenly nervous. The woman looked at him as if he had become merely a different version of the same cage. He stepped closer, unsure what to say, which was unusual for him. Up close, she looked even more dangerous and more exhausted at once. There were bruised shadows beneath her eyes, old seal scars along her neck, and fury held together by discipline so thin it could tear at a touch. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, and stripped of all illusion. "You bought me," she said. "Now finish it." Jonah had expected paperwork, not danger. The transfer rod in his hand still glowed with legal heat as he escorted Saelith out of the disposition ring and into the private processing corridors beneath the exchange hall. He had imagined that once the purchase cleared, the ugly part would be over. He was wrong. On Veyra Prime, buying a person was not a single act. It was the opening of a procedure, and procedure was where the real violence lived. The public sale had only shifted authority. It had not finished whatever had been done to her before he arrived. That unfinished state now sat in his name like a trap he had willingly stepped into. Saelith walked beside him under escort fields that answered to his transfer mark, but not to his comfort. The seals around her wrists had dimmed from execution blue to custody silver, yet they still hovered close enough to remind both of them that freedom was not what he had purchased. She moved with a rigid grace that made exhaustion look like discipline. Every few steps, she flicked a glance toward him, not with gratitude, not even with hatred in its hottest form, but with the colder judgment reserved for fools too blind to understand the ruin they had chosen. They reached a processing chamber shaped like a shrine, pretending to be an office. Thin columns of white light rose from the floor. Legal glyphs drifted in slow rings overhead. A circular platform waited in the center, surrounded by witness terminals and memory scanners woven into polished stone. Everything smelled faintly metallic, sterile, and ceremonial. Jonah had spent years dealing with port registries and freight courts, but this was different. This place was not built to record transactions. It was built to make obedience feel sacred. A functionary with translucent skin and gold latticework implanted along the jaw accepted Jonah's transfer rod and scanned it twice before speaking. Asset class remains unresolved. Completion required. Jonah frowned. Already paid. Purchase acknowledged. The functionary replied. Status not concluded. Possession without completion carries liability, ritual burden, and inherited claim exposure. That sentence alone told him he had made a much larger mistake than he realized. Saelith gave a tired, bitter laugh that barely made sound. Now he hears it. Jonah turned toward her. Then tell me clearly. Her eyes sharpened. You bought an ending, human, not a servant. The functionary raised a delicate hand and expanded the contract record in the air between them. Layers of legal code unfolded like glass petals opening. Most of it meant nothing to Jonah at first glance. Debt line transfers, sealed gene identifications, punitive lineage amendments, ceremonial notation written in a dialect older than the trade house itself. Buried at the center was the phrase repeated again and again. Completion pending. He asked what it meant, and this time the answer came in full, perhaps because the functionary wanted to enjoy his ignorance. Completion could take several recognized forms, depending on standing code, house petitions, and blood status. In low-class cases, it marked a permanent identity brand, reducing the bound subject into inheritable labor property with no restoration rights. In noble contaminated cases, it could trigger a neurological purge that erased lineage signatures from memory and body records. In penal closure events, it could authorize death under law, not as execution, but as final administrative settlement. In rarer ancient frameworks, almost never invoked now, completion once meant incorporation into a household through protected kinship, claim adoption, or covenantal union. Jonah stared at the floating clauses. You call all of those the same thing. Distinction is contextual. That's insane. The functionary's expression did not change. It is legal. Saelith looked at him with open contempt. That is how this world survives itself. Jonah suddenly understood the bitterness in her first words. Finish it had not been melodrama. It had been resignation. She had expected him to choose one final cruelty from a menu dressed up as order. The processing terminals required a declaration before custody could continue. If he delayed too long, default protocols would route the matter back to the exchange authorities. If he chose wrongly, the system would carve the choice into Saelith's body, name, and future with total legitimacy. The pressure settled on his shoulders with almost physical weight. He had acted on instinct in the market. Now instinct was no longer enough. He demanded access to complete legal history. The functionary hesitated just enough to be suspicious. Restricted by class. I'm the registered holder. You are the registered liable party. That is not the same privilege. Before Jonah could snap back, A dry voice emerged from one of the side stations. On this world, it rarely is. The speaker stepped from behind a column of data glass, carrying a stack of hand slates, so old-fashioned they looked rebellious. He was narrow-shouldered, gray-eyed, and dressed like a scholar who had long ago been exiled from rooms where better fabrics were allowed. Fine metallic script ran along the side of his neck, but portions of it had been burned out, as if someone had once stripped rank or office from him by erasing the proof directly from his skin. He introduced himself as Terav, Archive Clerk 3rd Class, Legal Recovery Division, though the title sounded less like employment and more like survival after disgrace. The Magister flagged the transfer for anomaly review, Terav said. A human overpaying for a completion subject with contaminated lineage is either romantic stupidity or a legal event. I came to see which. Jonah folded his arms. And Terav glanced at Saelith, then at the code web. I'm beginning to suspect event. Saelith stiffened at the sight of him. You know what they did? Yes, Terav said quietly. That is why I'm still alive only on paper. He requested a deeper pull from the lattice. The functionary objected, but Terav cited Archive Audit Authority in a string of ancient procedural terms that made the overhead sigils change color. Hidden layers of the record unlocked. Jonah watched line after line unfold and felt anger rising with each one. Saelith had not simply fallen into debt. Her status had been broken deliberately through a sequence of legal degradations spread across years. He saw house seizure notices, inheritance revisions, contamination claims, and the quiet reclassification of a bloodline from protected to disputable, then disputable to service-eligible, then service-eligible to disposable. Someone hunted her family through law, Jonas said. Terav gave the smallest nod. That is often more efficient than hunting with soldiers. Saelith did not look surprised. She looked tired in a way that suggested surprise had been beaten out of her long ago. Then Terav found the contradiction. It sat buried beneath obsolete ceremonial code, flagged as enacted by modern practice yet never formally repealed. He opened it with visible disbelief. Older law recognized certain unresolved persons not as property candidates, but as displaced lineage bearers under war aftercare statutes. If such a subject was transferred to an external citizen lacking house claim rights, private ownership was explicitly forbidden. Completion in those cases could only proceed through protected guest right, household incorporation, or equal covenant recognized across species under antiquated charter law. Jonah read the clause twice. Equal covenant. Terav's mouth tightened. Yes. The functionary reacted first with outrage, then with fear. That article is dormant. Dormant is not void, Terav replied. It has not been applied in centuries, and yet it remains in force. Jonah looked from the clause to Saelith. They've been processing people under corrupted law. Saelith's voice came sharp as broken glass. Do not say people as if you only discovered we qualified. That hit where it should have. He accepted it. You're right, he said. I'm late. For the first time, something uncertain moved behind her anger. Not trust, only the discomfort of hearing a human admit fault without trying to decorate it. The chamber pressed in around them. If the old clause was real, then every official here had reason to bury it. If it was invoked, Saelith could not legally be finalized as property. But the alternatives were no less explosive. Guest right would place her under Jonah's protected household as a dependent. Household incorporation would create long-term kin obligations recognized across jurisdictions. Equal covenant was the most dangerous of all, because in modern language it translated into something close to marital bond, though older law treated it more as a mutual civil shield forged between peoples after war. Jonah asked the one question that mattered. Which choice protect her most? Terav answered immediately. Equal covenant. It is the hardest to challenge. Saelith's head snapped toward him. No. Jonah turned too. Why no? Because you do not understand what you are saying yes to. Her control finally cracked enough for real emotion to show. They erase us by turning us into roles. Asset, debtor, criminal, dependent. If you bind me to yourself under covenant law, you save my life by deciding it for me. The truth of that landed hard. Jonah felt it like a blow because she was right again. He had acted in the market to stop a visible wrong. But saving someone while overriding their choice could still be another form of power wearing noble clothes. He looked at the clock glyph spinning above the chamber. Default return protocols were already counting down. If I do nothing, he said, they take you back. If you act, she replied, you time me to another system. Would you rather I let them finish it their way? Saelith said nothing. Her silence was answer enough and accusation besides. Terev stepped closer to the terminal. There may not be a clean path left, only a less monstrous one. That was the sentence that made the decision real. Jonah drew a slow breath and felt every bad consequence waiting beyond it. Financial ruin, legal retaliation, public scandal, human authorities deciding he had become too costly to defend, alien authorities deciding he had insulted sacred order, Saelith hating him for surviving the wrong way. All of it stood there, clear as day. But so did the alternative, and the alternative was surrendering her to a machine because he was afraid of the mess required to stop it. He placed his hand on the central declaration field. I invoke external claimant restriction, he said. I reject private ownership completion. I recognize Saelith under equal covenant protection pursuant to the original charter. The chamber froze. The overhead sigils flashed gold, then crimson, then a color Jonah had never seen before, somewhere between oath and alarm. The functionary made a sound of genuine horror. Terev actually laughed once in stunned disbelief. Across the floor, the seals around Saelith's wrists changed shape, uncoiling from possession marks in braided bands of legal light that linked her record to Jonah's. Not master to property, not buyer to asset, bound parties under protected reciprocal status. The lattice accepted. That was the most terrifying part, not because it was dramatic, but because it was effortless. The system had been waiting all this time for someone to say the forgotten words aloud. Alerts detonated across the chamber. Unauthorized covenant activation. Archive contradiction. Lineage restoration risk. The functionary began shouting for supervisory override. Doors sealed. Distantly, Jonah heard other terminals waking throughout the hall, as if the legal network itself had felt a bruise and was beginning to probe it. Saelith stared at the light around her wrists like it had betrayed her personally. You idiot, she whispered. Jonah swallowed. That seems fair. You absolute, impossible idiot. The anger in her face was alive now, tangled with shock, humiliation, and something even more destabilizing. Safety. Not complete, not trusted, but present enough to terrify her. He had not finished her the way she expected. He had finished the contract by breaking its intended shape. Officials began pounding at the sealed doors. Voices rose outside. Blasphemy. Fraud. Contamination. Nullification demand. Terev gathered his slates with shaking hands and looked between them like a man who had just seen a tomb open from the inside. Congratulations, he said. You are now both either protected by ancient law or about to be hunted across half this world. Jonah looked at Saelith, at the bond light binding their records together, at the outrage building beyond the chamber walls. What's the difference? He asked. Saelith met his eyes, furious and shaken and no longer entirely alone inside the system that had tried to erase her. On this world, she said, usually timing. The chamber doors had barely finished sealing when the city began trying to correct what Jonah had done. Alerts rippled outward through the exchange hall, then through the district, then across the legal mesh that bound Veyra Prime together more tightly than gravity. Jonah could feel the world reacting through the floor. It was not outrage in the emotional sense. It was procedural panic. Ancient clauses had awakened inside modern systems that depended on those clauses remaining decorative fossils. Somewhere above them, brokers were already filing emergency reversals. Somewhere deeper, lineage monitors were checking dormant claims. Somewhere in a cleaner, richer tower, someone important had just realized that Saelith had not merely survived. She had become dangerous again. Terev moved first. He crossed the chamber in 3 quick strides and began stripping record slivers from the side terminals with the efficient hands of a man long practiced in theft that the law preferred to call preservation. The functionary was still shouting into an override channel, voice shaking with indignation and fear, but fear had already won. He wanted authority to arrive before responsibility could settle on him personally. "They will freeze transit within minutes," Tariff said. "If the Covenant stands long enough to register across district servers, some courts must honor it. If the brokers reach it first, they will bury the old clause under emergency nullification." Jonah still had not fully processed the weight of the glowing bands at his and Saelith's wrists. They no longer resembled restraints. They looked more intimate than that, and more dangerous. The light linked their legal signatures in slow spirals, pulsing whenever nearby scanners tried to read them. Protection and exposure in the same breath. Saelith stared at the bond mark with naked disgust. "You tethered me to a stranger. I kept them from wiping you out. You did both." That shut him up because she was right again, and he was running out of defenses against the truth of her. Tariff handed Jonah a thin slate. "There's a narrow customs corridor through the lower transit spire. It still reports to mixed jurisdiction. If we reach it before the exchange petitions consolidate, you might get to orbital clearance." "Might?" Jonah asked. Tariff gave him a bleak look. "Your bond is recognized in 3 old charters, disputed in 6 mercantile courts, blasphemous in 2 sect jurisdictions, and economically inconvenient in all of them. That sounds bad. It is mathematically worse than bad." Outside, heavy impacts struck the sealed doors. Saelith stepped back from the central platform, shoulders tight, eyes already recalculating escape routes with the fast, cold intelligence of someone who had survived too long by reading danger before it touched her. Jonah noticed then that she never asked whether he planned to leave her. She only assessed whether he was competent enough not to get her recaptured in the process. The chamber side wall split open under Tara's emergency archive key, revealing a maintenance passage full of pale steam and service conduits. The 3 of them moved without ceremony. Behind them, the functionary kept shouting legal phrases like prayers no longer working. The passage opened into the lower contract district, and Veyra Prime's polished cruelty showed its teeth. Above, the Grand Exchange towers still shone like jewel mathematics. Down here, the beauty thinned into stacked walkways, conveyor bridges, and projection nets where lesser contracts were processed in endless tides. Workers moved beneath hanging sigils that displayed their service categories. Debt crews in gray, gene-bound artisans in blue, penal labor bands in red. Overhead, courier drones swarmed between registry nodes, carrying the cities while in sealed pulses of light. Jonah had thought he understood the market from its ceremonial center. He had not. The real city was this living diagram of ranked obedience, every path telling you what kind of person the law believed you were. And now that same city had begun hunting them. Public displays flashed with updated notices. Covenant irregularity. Asset contamination event. Temporary restriction orders. Jonah's image appeared on one wall in grainy market capture beside phrases like unlawful invocation, commercial sabotage, and foreign procedural abuse. Saelith's image carried more careful language. Protected subject under dispute. Lineage hazard. Do not transfer without tribunal authority. "She's a hazard now," Jonas said. "She always was," Saelith replied. "The difference is that now you can read it." They cut through a market vein crowded with buyers and bonded laborers. Some stepped aside at the sight of the glowing Covenant bands and looked away fast, as if witnessing old law in public might itself become punishable. Others stared openly. Jonah caught disgust, curiosity, calculation, and once from an elderly dock worker with half his face marked by service code scars, something like fierce hope. The old alien bowed his head once to Saelith as they passed. She almost stumbled. It was the first crack Jonah had seen in her armor that did not look like anger. They were halfway to the transit spire when the law marshals found them. The first warning came as silence. Market ads vanished from the air. Sales sigils blinked out. Overhead lanes emptied in a practiced wave as civilians recognized enforcement lockdown before outsiders did. Then armored figures dropped from the upper walkways on grav lines, cloaks stiff with embedded authority glyphs, helms faceless behind mirrored black. Martial units. Their leader projected an order field across the junction ahead. By authority of mercantile peace and social continuity, the Covenant transfer is suspended pending review. Surrender the disputed subject and submit for liability division. Jonah kept moving until Saelith caught his sleeve hard enough to stop him. Do not talk to them like they are reasonable, she said. I wasn't planning to. That felt wise. Reasonability had already been priced out of the situation. The lead marshal raised a hand. Shot grids unfolded along the walls. Side routes sealed behind descending legal barriers woven from hard light and contract code. This was the part of Veyra Prime Jonah hated most. Even violence here wore formal clothes. Terav leaned close and muttered, "Left corridor on my mark. Their barriers obey district mapping, not old service tunnels." "You sound too calm," Jonah whispered back. I panicked very efficiently. The first stun volley lit the air blue. Jonah shoved Saelith down behind a freight pillar as the charge burst against stone and sent a wave of static through his teeth. Terav slapped a stolen archive chip into a maintenance socket, and half the corridor signage changed at once, rerouting flow permissions. Somewhere machinery groaned. A service wall unlocked 2 meters to the left. Now, Terav snapped. They ran. The passage beyond was too narrow for formal pursuit, which only made it more dangerous. Steam hissed from cracked coolant veins. Old data cables hung like roots from the ceiling. Jonah followed Terav through bins that seemed impossible to navigate without map implants. Saelith just behind him, silent except for breathing kept too controlled. Stunned fire flashed at their backs when marshals found access ports and shot blind through the bulkheads. One bolt caught Jonah's shoulder and numbed his arm to the wrist. He bit down a curse and kept moving. The tunnel spat them into the transit spire's interior liftworks, a cathedral-sized shaft crisscrossed by freight platforms, passenger lifts, and suspended tracks carrying seal capsules toward orbital customs. Light fell through it in blue and gold sheets from 100 moving screens. Sirens were building now, not emergency sirens exactly, but civic correction tones, the soundtrack of a city trying to drag itself back in a legal shape. Above, customs gates were already sealing. Terav looked up and swore softly. Too late for clean departure. Then what? Jonah asked. Saelith pointed across the shaft toward an older platform half hidden behind maintenance screens. Undercity tribunal access. Mixed archive jurisdiction. If they cannot seize me cleanly, they will have to argue. Jonah almost laughed despite everything. You say that like arguing is safer. On this world, she said, sometimes it is. Getting there required crossing 3 active freight lines, while marshals descended from both ends of the shaft. The move should have been impossible. It became merely terrible. Jonah leaped first onto a cargo sled, moving too fast for comfort, boots skidding on magnet plates. Terav nearly lost his balance, transferring behind him, clutching his slates to his chest like sacred texts. Saelith made the jump last and landed with a grace that looked effortless until Jonah saw the tremor in her right hand. She had been exhausted long before he bought her. The city was now demanding more endurance than she had left. A martial line opened fire from the upper rail. Saelith pulled Jonah down a heartbeat before the volley crossed where his head had been. The shot scorched the air hot enough to sting his face. He looked at her, startled. "You do not get to die for me yet," she said. It was not tenderness. It still felt like Trust's first surviving fragment. They rode the sled into a maintenance transfer and dropped hard onto the tribunal platform. Behind them, Terav triggered a freight collision by overloading route permissions with archive authority codes. 2 heavy cargo frames slammed together in the shaft, scattering sparks and forcing the pursuing marshals to pull back before the entire liftway became a firestorm. It bought them minutes. On Veyra Prime, minutes could decide whether someone remained a person. The Undercity Tribunal was less elegant than the Exchange Hall, and somehow more honest for it. Stone older than the city's upper towers formed the walls. Projection fields flickered instead of glowing cleanly. Here the law looked tired, used, less like divinity and more like the scar tissue of civilizations that had survived by writing rules after too much blood. Saelith slowed as they entered the archive threshold beyond the tribunal chambers. For the first time since Jonah had seen her, she looked almost afraid in a way that had nothing to do with capture. "This is where my house vanished," she said. Terav answered quietly. "Then perhaps this is where it begins returning." The hidden archive lay behind broken jurisdiction seals, accessible only because Terav still carried the remnants of authority someone had tried and failed to erase completely. Vault doors opened one by one as he fed old codes into dead readers. Dustless air met them, cool and stale, preserving memory the way tombs preserve kings. Shelves of crystal record rods stretched into darkness. Suspended orbs held lineage maps, frozen mid-update centuries ago. At the center waited a dormant chamber shaped around a circular dais of black stone, above which hung the oldest symbol Jonah had yet seen in this world. Not the chain knot of ownership used by modern brokers, but an open ring crossed by two joined lines. "What is that?" Jonah asked. Saelith stared at it, as if seeing a ghost were her face. "Household Valmark. Pre-division era." Terav activated the central memory well, and the chamber filled with layered voices from the past. The records did not speak in the language of ownership. They spoke of aftermath, of worlds shattered by interspecies war, of displaced survivors who could not safely return to their own people and could not be abandoned among former enemies without legal protection stronger than charity. The original completion right had not been built to brand property. It had been built to bind responsibility, to place the displaced in a household's guest rights and covenant protections that made mistreatment a crime against both law and honor. It was not perfect. It was messy, intimate, and difficult, but it had begun as an answer to catastrophe, not a market convenience. Over generations, powerful houses had changed it. Terms narrowed. Obligations became asymmetrical. Kinship thinned into custody, then ownership. Eventually the rituals remained, but their soul had been hollowed out and sold. Saelith listened without moving. As more records surfaced, so did her family's role in the old fracture. Her house had opposed the changes. Not nobly in every detail, not flawlessly, but openly enough to matter. They had argued that personhood could not remain stable in any civilization that made legal objecthood hereditary. For that, they were attacked through courts, stripped through audits, and erased through policy until their names survived mainly as contamination. Jonah looked at her then and understood the scale differently. She had not been born into random misfortune. She had been a last loose end in a political murder stretched across generations. "You were never meant to pay debt," he said. "You were meant to disappear." She gave him a look full of old bitterness. "Now you begin to sound educated." He accepted the insult because he had earned it. "You should have told me." "And when would that have mattered?" she shot back. "Before you purchased my fate? Before you rewrote it? Before you decided I would rather be bound to you than erased by them?" The chamber went still around them. Jonah felt the force of the question all the way through. He had been so focused on opposing cruelty that he had made himself the clean exception in his own mind. But she had lived the truth he only stumbled into. Every system on this world decided things for her. Then he arrived and did the same, only with better intentions. That did not erase the wound. "I thought saving you fast was better than losing you carefully," he said. Saelith's expression shifted, not softer, just more tired. "It may have been. That does not make it gentle." Terav, wisely, kept silent. For several breaths, they stood there among the ghosts of a law that had once tried to be better. The bond marks at Jonah's and Saelith's wrists pulsed in faint matching light, less like a romance than a question no one had answered properly yet. At last Jonah said, "I can void it if that becomes the only way you stay yourself." Saelith looked at him sharply. "If you void it now, I lose the one shield strong enough to delay them." "I know. You would do that if you asked." That was the moment something changed. Not trust, not forgiveness, but shape. She saw that he was reckless, yes, self-righteous, certainly, and dangerously human in all the worst and best meanings of the word. But he was also beginning to understand that personhood defended without listening could still become another cage. The archive lights flickered. An alert pulse rolled through the floor. Tarav checked the outer feed and went pale. We have another problem. Jonah was getting tired of those. Tarav turned the display toward them. Noble claim warrants, broker reversal petitions, martial seizure orders, public debate storms, human consular warnings advising Jonah Vale to detach immediately from all disputed alien obligations or face permanent trade sanctions. And behind all of them, one name rising repeatedly through secured channels. Lady Iller. Saelith's face hardened at once. She knows. Who is she? Jonah asked. The woman whose lies profited most from my family's destruction, Saelith said. If she reaches me first, she will not need to kill me. She will simply make the law finish what it started. Outside the archive, the city was closing again. Inside, among the buried records, Jonah looked at the glowing bond on his wrist and understood at last that he had not bought a person, or saved one, or even merely offended a market. He had stepped into a war fought through law, memory, and identity, and the woman bound to him by desperate ancient words was no passenger in that war. She was one of its last surviving reasons. The archive alert did not sound like panic. It sounded older than that. A low harmonic pulse rolled through the buried chamber, vibrating the black stone dais beneath Jonah's boots and sending pale rings of light up the walls in widening circles. The hidden records around them dimmed, then brightened again under outside demand. Someone with enormous authority was trying to seize the archive's legal core from above, not by brute force alone, but by drowning it in modern command privileges before the old protections could fully wake. Veyra Prime was not simply closing around them now. It was choosing a side. Tara's hands flew across the cracked archive console. They're moving the conflict upward, he said. The Undercity Vault was only the key. The Central Registry has begun challenge review. Saelith understood first. The Judicial Cathedral. Jonah looked between them. That sound bad. It is where the lattice thinks about itself, Tarav said. That was bad enough. The Central Judicial Cathedral sat at the heart of Veyra Prime's oldest district, built atop the original contract engine for which the modern city had grown fat and cruel. Above ground, it was famous for its white spires, treaty mirrors, and singing halls where noble houses swore commercial peace before turning around to gut one another in more elegant language. Beneath those ceremonial towers, however, lived the living heart of the contract lattice, an ancient legal intelligence woven from memory crystal, biological encoding, and oath-responsive machine logic. If Saelith reached it with the restored records of her house, and the covenant still intact, she could force the system to compare its original charter to the civilization now feeding on its corrupted form. If she failed, the same core could be rewritten to erase the last proof that the old law had ever meant anything more than ownership. No one in the chamber wasted time debating whether to go. They simply moved. The route upward became a race through layers of the city designed to keep truth expensive. Tarav led them through archive lifts, sealed maintenance shafts, and forgotten magistrate corridors lined with dead family emblems. Above, the city trembled under conflicting orders. Public notices demanded calm, while private networks burned with rumor. Jonah's face and Saelith's spread through every district feed. To some, they were criminals. To others, they were martyrs in progress. Human channels grew uglier as well. Several consular agents sent Jonah direct warnings urging immediate detachment, claiming no citizen had any duty to become collateral in an alien legal implosion. One message from an old freight associate was simpler and somehow more honest. Get out now. No cargo is worth becoming history over. Jonah deleted it unread after the first line. By the time they emerged near the cathedral district, Veyra Prime had become a city at war with its own paperwork. Crowds packed the lower plazas beneath the white towers. Bonded laborers stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants, dismissed clerks, house retainers, freed debtors, and legal students skipping fear because they had spent too long waiting for outrage to become useful. Projection walls flooded the night with contract diagrams, contested lineage maps, and excerpts from the old charter tariff had already leaked through hidden archive channels. The words moved from tower to tower like fire catching in dry grass. Personhood cannot be rendered transferable by inheritance. Displaced beings retain restoration standing. Covenant protection supersedes commodification. Ancient law was speaking in public again, and modern power hated the sound of it. Armored lines held the cathedral steps. Marshal Vorek stood at their center. He was broader than Jonah expected, wrapped in dark authority, plating etched with civic order marks, so deep they looked branded rather than worn. His face carried no ornament, only control carved to the edge of cruelty. Some people were violent because anger ruled them. Vorek was more dangerous. He believed force was hygiene. When his gaze landed on Saelith, it held no personal hatred, only the cold irritation of a system seeing an old error-refused deletion. "You are all under corrective detention," he announced, his voice amplified across the plaza by civic harmonics. "The disputed covenant is suspended. Archive leakage is sedition. The lineage claimant will be remanded for stabilizing review." The crowd hissed, then wavered, then steadied. Jonah stepped forward before he had fully decided to. Maybe that was the most human thing about him. Not bravery as such, just an inability to stay still when authority started speaking like people were forms to be filed. "You keep saying stabilizing," he called back. Funny word for erasing somebody. Heads turned. Some in the crowd recognized him at once and began passing his name outward in ripples. Vorek regarded him with visible contempt. Foreign interference does not become wisdom because it is loud. Jonah almost smiled despite the danger. Neither does slavery become law because it's old. That struck harder than any weapon could have. The crowd made a sound then, low and gathering, because everyone on the plaza understood what had just happened. A human had said the quiet word aloud in front of the city's enforcers. Not bonded service. Not transfer compliance. Slavery. Vorek's response was immediate. He raised one hand, and the front marshal line advanced. Before they could lock the plaza, another force entered the field. Lady Iller arrived, not from the steps, but from above. Her transport descended through the cathedral light like a blade wrapped in silk. She emerged amid attendants and legal drones, every movement measured, every detail of her appearance built to reassure the world that civilization still belonged to people like her. She was beautiful in the same way poisoned water could be beautiful, clear enough to mistake for purity until it killed what trusted it. Her house sigils glimmered along sleeves woven with ancestral code. When she looked at Saelith, the years of buried conflict between their lines seemed to sharpen the air. "How dramatic," Iller said softly, though the plaza heard every word through her drones. A relic claimant, a disgraced archivist, and a human moralist trying to break a city by misunderstanding it. Saelith stepped forward before Jonah could answer. "You did not misunderstand it. You built it this way." For the first time, emotion touched Iller's face. Not guilt, offense. "Your family preferred chaos," she said. "They romanticized old obligations no modern civilization could survive. We chose order. You chose ownership. We chose continuity," Iller snapped. "Trade, predictability, social peace. Do you imagine worlds stay fed because everyone becomes free at once? Do you imagine labor structures unwind themselves politely? Your bloodline lost because it worshipped ideals above function." The argument landed precisely where it was meant to. Into the crowd. Into Jonah. Into every frightened person who suspected injustice was terrible, but instability might be worse. That was how these systems survived. Not by convincing everyone they were good, only by convincing enough people they were necessary. Tarav moved to the plaza's public relay plinth and jammed his archive slate into its core port. The city screens flared. Original records poured out across the cathedral face in cascading light. War refugee statutes. Household protection covenants. Testimonies from mixed-species survivors describing why the bond system had been created after the ancient wars. It was not sentimental history. It was harsh, practical, and unmistakable. The old law had understood that displaced beings could not be healed by being turned into cargo. The completion rite had once been a promise that no civilization worthy of surviving would reduce trauma into property. Then came the evidence of corruption. Amendments hidden in generational layers. House interventions. Audit tampering. Genealogical suppression orders. Records showing Saelith's family opposing the transformation of protective law into inherited objecthood, and records showing how they had been dismantled for it piece by piece until their descendants could be sold. The plaza exploded with noise. Some shouted for restoration. Some shouted that the archive was forged. Some simply stared at the walls, as if watching their own lives acquire names no one had dared use before. Vorek ordered seizure. Iller ordered suppression. Terev kept transmitting with the fierce, hopeless courage of a man who had finally found a truth worth dying in public for. And still, revelation alone did not stop violence. The martial lines advanced under riot fields. Drone suppressors descended from the cathedral towers. Somewhere in the upper balconies, hired operatives shifted into sniper position under noble warrants. Jonah saw it all in fragments, and understood at once that proof was never enough against power unless someone survived long enough to make proof operational. "Go," he said to Saelith. Her eyes snapped to him. "You cannot hold this alone. Wasn't planning to hold it. Just slow it. That is not better. It is if it works." They ran for the cathedral entrance while the plaza broke apart. The interior was worse than the exterior because here corruption wore holiness. Pillars of living crystal rose into a dome full of suspended law song, each note encoded with treaty memory. The floor beneath their feet held millions of glowing names in slow orbit. Every person, house, debt, and covenant processed through the lattice's central thought. At the far end, beyond a ring of witness altars, stood the legal core, a sphere of white-black glass threaded with branching light like roots made of judgment. It was beautiful enough to hurt, ancient enough to feel less built than grown. Saelith slowed as they approached it. The covenant marks at her wrist, and Jonah's flared in response. The core had recognized the paradox already. Buyer and purchased, yet not owner and property. External citizen and protected lineage. Emergency covenant formed under dormant law, yet validated by the lattice itself. Their bond was not romantic, not symbolic, and not simple. It was a legal contradiction standing upright in the middle of a civilization built on pretending such contradictions no longer existed. Behind them, footsteps thundered. Vorek's marshals had breached the interior. From the upper aisles came another threat. Human corporate agents in polished armor, faces hidden behind trade masks. Jonah recognized their insignia with sick disbelief. They were not there to help him. They were there to buy the collapse. If alien monopolies over contract law shattered, human interests wanted access to the debris. One of them called out over a private band only Jonah's implant could hear. "Stand down and hand the claimant over. We can negotiate a controlled reform package. You do not want spontaneous liberation. Markets will tear themselves apart." Jonah sent back the only answer he had. "Funny. That sounded exactly like them." He severed the channel. Saelith reached the witness ring around the core and placed her hand against the first altar. The system lit beneath her touch, then hesitated. Her lineage was there, buried under false revisions and debt scars, but still alive enough to answer. Around the chamber, dormant house sigils flickered back into existence. Ghost names stirred under the floor. Erased persons began returning as data shadows throughout the lattice. The city was remembering what it had done. "Claim authority." A noble voice shouted from the doorway. "Take the core and restore your house." "Do it," cried another from the crowd, now spilling into the lower chamber. "Rule before they erase you again." At the same time, a hidden sniper line painted red across Saelith's spine. Jonah moved before thought. He hit her hard enough to drive them both behind the witness altar as the shot cracked through the air and shattered crystal where her heart had been. Pain tore along his side a heartbeat later. He had not fully avoided it. Heat flooded his ribs. He stayed upright, mostly through insulted momentum. Saelith caught him before he fell. Her hands came away red. "Why?" she demanded, furious in the raw, frightened way only truth can make a voice. "Because they keep trying to decide your use," he said through clenched teeth. "And I'm getting sick of it." That, more than anything, steadied her. Vorek entered the chamber below riot shields. Iller followed behind protected glass, still elegant, still sure this could yet be contained. Terev staggered in from a side, aisle bleeding from the scalp. Archive slate clutched to his chest like scripture pulled from fire. "This is your last stable moment," Iller said to Saelith. "Claim a lattice. Take your rightful place. Control the transition. Without hierarchy, these worlds will burn." Saelith looked from Iller to Vorek, then to the human agents waiting like vultures behind commerce flags, then finally to Jonah, bleeding on sacred stone because he had chosen again and again to treat her not as an answer, but as a person. That was when she understood the trap in every offer. A throne was only another form of ownership when built on the same machine. She rose and stepped fully into the witness ring. The core brightened until every face in the chamber became stark with reflected judgment. Its ancient voice filled the hall not as sound alone, but as pressure in bone and memory. Claimant standing confirmed. Covenant paradox active. Restoration authority available. Exclusive control pathway unresolved. Saelith lifted her head. "I refuse exclusive claim," she said. The chamber seemed to recoil. Iller went pale. Vorek actually stopped moving. Saelith continued, voice strengthening with each word. "This lattice was built to protect the displaced, not sell them. I invoke charter restoration. Open suppressed personhood records. Void hereditary transfer status. End conversion of living beings into transferable property. Remove exclusive house ownership pathways from completion law." The core did not accept immediately. It looked to the paradox. To Jonah. His covenant mark burned like a brand made of light. The system required reciprocal acknowledgement because the old law had been built on mutual obligation, not unilateral mercy. He understood then what it was asking. Not whether he possessed her, whether he recognized her choice, even if that choice burned every advantage he could have claimed under their bond. Blood slicked aside. The city roared around them. He still found the breath to laugh once, short and pained. "About time," he said, and placed his hand against the altar. "I affirm." The lattice resolved. Light detonated through the cathedral floor and shot upward through every tower on Veyra Prime. Across the city, contract sigils changed. Ownership chains snapped into review status. Sealed names unlocked. Debt-born non-persons reappeared in public records as legal beings. Service inheritances froze. House vaults screamed open under audit storms. Markets seized. Freight halted. Banking cores looped in panic. In labor barracks, prison docks, gene mills, and servant compounds, people looked up as the systems that defined them as assets began forgetting how. The shockwave was not physical. It was civilizational. Vorek shouted for shutdown. His marshals rushed the ring. Human opportunists ran competing extraction codes into their own uplinks. Iller ordered total severance of the cathedral grid. None of it mattered quickly enough. The core had already moved beyond personal command into distributed restoration. Saelith did not take power. She broke the machine's right to own. That was far worse and far better. The chamber's support fields convulsed under overload. Crystal cracked. Lawsong collapsed into a sound like a choir, trying not to become a scream. Jonah dragged himself upright enough to keep one marshal from reaching Saelith with a null blade, then took a strike to the shoulder that dropped him to one knee. Terev smashed his archive slate into a drone cluster and laughed like a man who had chosen his side too completely to fear the invoice. Saelith remained in the ring until the final restoration pulse cleared and the exclusive pathways burned out of the lattice forever. Then the chamber fell into stunned, echoing light. No one had won cleanly. The city below was already entering panic. Commerce would rupture. Noble houses would splinter. Freed populations would surge into a future with no structure ready to receive them fairly. The powerful would call it chaos because for once the law had stopped protecting their convenience first. Saelith stepped back from the core and looked at the ruins spreading through every system she had just changed. Jonah met her gaze through pain and smoke. Freedom had come. It simply looked nothing like peace. The first thing that broke was not the government. It was certainty. Across Veyra Prime and the trade worlds tied to its lattice, names reappeared where numbers had lived for generations. Servitude ledgers failed. Inheritance chains froze mid-transfer. Family vaults opened to reveal bloodlines that had been declared extinct, contaminated, or legally null. In labor compounds, processing towers, mining stations, and debt barracks, people looked up from lives that had always been measured for them and discovered that the systems defining them as assets no longer agreed on who owned whom. Some ran at once. Some stayed frozen, too wounded by habit to trust freedom on first sight. Some wept. Some rioted. Some simply asked the nearest official a question the old order had never prepared to answer. What happens to me now? No one had a clean answer. The contract order did not collapse like a tyrant statue. It collapsed like a bridge everyone had been forced to live on. Great sections of commerce went down with it. Freight chains halted. Debt markets convulsed. Production worlds that had relied on hereditary labor codes entered immediate panic as owners, governors, and syndicates realized their entire economies had been built on unequal personhood wearing legal perfume. Reformers celebrated in the streets with the fierce joy of people who had outlived the impossible. Traditionalists called it civilizational suicide. Traders cursed. Priests argued. Opportunists arrived from every nearby system to buy, sell, rescue, exploit, document, or profit from the wreckage. The same event was called liberation, sabotage, awakening, contagion, and market terrorism, depending on who held the microphone. At the center of all of it, Jonah Vale discovered that saving one person had made him public property. His face spread farther after the cathedral than it had after the purchase. Some networks painted him as the reckless human who had broken a legal order he did not understand. Others cast him as a folk hero, the outsider stubborn enough to ask why law was being used to polish cruelty instead of restrain it. On labor channels, his words in the plaza became slogan and joke at once. On merchant channels, his name became a warning used in tense negotiations. Do not let a Jonah into your contracts. Satire feeds mocked him as the man who came to buy engine rights and accidentally detonated a civilization. Revolutionary groups used the story of how he had finished the bond as rallying myth, proof that the whole machine could be broken from inside if someone was willing to say the forbidden meaning out loud. To some, he was a criminal. To others, he was the clearest thing courage had looked like in years. Jonah hated both versions because neither of them had to limp through recovery with cracked ribs and a life he no longer recognized. Saelith hated her own new myth just as much. For worlds that had lived under erased records and inherited bondage, she became something between a witness and a symbol. The last daughter of a murdered house. The woman who reached the legal heart and refused a throne. The one who could have ruled and instead broke the right to own. It sounded noble when other people said it. Living inside, it was harder. Freedom did not arrive as peace. It arrived as absence. For the first time in her life, she was no longer being defined against a cage. No contract assigned her value. No seal marked her for transfer. No authority could reduce her into a lesser legal state with a gesture and a sanctified lie. That should have felt simple. It did not. A self built under pressure does not instantly know what shape to take once the pressure lifts. She spent the first recovery days speaking before councils, identifying false records, and helping the newly restored find the names stolen from them. She did it because it mattered and because stillness frightened her more. In quiet moments, she would stop in the middle of a sentence, as if some part of her still expected an override command to descend from the ceiling and drag her back into a role. No one who had not lived inside object had understood how loud freedom could be when it first arrived. Jonah saw that, and for once he did not try to fix it quickly. That was part of what changed between them. Their bond still existed in law, but the crisis had transformed its meaning. At first, it had been a shield forged under desperation, a violent improvisation against a system that offered only uglier choices. Now it had become a question neither of them could ignore. What remained between them once survival no longer made the answer for them. Gratitude was too small and too simple. Resentment still lived there too, and rightly so. Jonah had saved Saelith's life without asking what it would cost her to be saved that way. Saelith knew that. Jonah knew it too now, not defensively but fully. At the same time, she had watched him bleed rather than let others decide her use again. He had seen her stand before the legal core and refuse power when vengeance and authority would both have been easier stories. Trust did not arrive as confession or romance. It arrived in practical ways. He asked before entering her space. She stopped assuming every kindness concealed an ownership claim. He offered the bond for dissolution more than once when legal conditions allowed it. She never answered immediately, which told him more than a dramatic yes or no could have. They argued often and sometimes viciously, but the arguments had changed. They no longer fought as rescuer and rescued, owner and owned, or even merely human and alien. They fought as two damaged people trying to decide whether the thing linking them had become real enough to survive choice. Terav, to the surprise of almost everyone except perhaps himself, became indispensable. In the vacuum left by the cathedral rupture, he helped establish a provisional restoration archive, part tribunal, part memory hospital, part legal morgue. His work was ugly and endless. He spent his days verifying restored persons, unpicking false genealogies, and arguing with surviving administrators who wanted reform without consequences. He looked terrible and seemed quietly delighted by it. Years of being treated as a disgraced clerk had left him perfectly suited to rebuilding truth from ruins. If law had once been turned into a machine for elegant cruelty, he intended to make it answer, line by line, for every stolen life it had helped erase. Marshal Vorek did not become a martyr to order. Reports placed him alive, injured, and under sealed detention pending review by mixed jurisdiction authorities unwilling to let his case become public theater too soon. Lady Iller survived as well, politically wounded but not destroyed, which was perhaps the most realistic outcome of all. Systems that old rarely died cleanly. They shed names, sacrificed lieutenants, and learned how to speak reform while waiting for exhaustion to make injustice fashionable again. Her fall mattered. It simply was not enough by itself. That truth haunted the victory and grounded it. Because the triumph, such as it was, had never been conquest. No human fleet had arrived to impose moral order on an alien civilization. No superior weapon had won the day. One stubborn man had refused to pretend legality automatically meant justice, and one woman who had every reason to choose revenge had instead chosen a freedom large enough to destabilize everyone, including herself. That was the human victory in it. Not domination. Refusal. Refusal to accept that cruelty became civilized once it was well documented. Later, when the first wave of panic had become the long, harder labor of rebuilding, Jonah found Saelith standing over a restoration wall full of names that had not existed in public memory a week earlier. The light from the wall reflected across her face, making her look at once older and more alive than when he first saw her beneath the auction sigils. "We can end the bond now," he said quietly. "If that's what freedom looks like for you." She did not answer for several breaths. When she finally turned toward him, there was no anger in her expression this time, only honesty carrying all the complicated weight they had survived through. "Not yet," she said. "I would like for once to decide something slowly." And that, more than any vow forced by law or crisis, felt like the first truly free beginning either of them had been allowed. Months later, the stars around Veyra Prime no longer looked quiet. From the cockpit canopy of Jonah's battered hauler, the trade lanes glittered with new traffic, relief ships, legal envoys, refugee carriers, archive vessels, and opportunists chasing profit through the cracks of a changing civilization. Entire systems were still arguing over the meaning of personhood after the lattice rupture. Some worlds had begun restoring erased citizens with trembling care. Others resisted every audit, every name correction, every challenge to old contract wealth. In port after port, Jonah and Saelith moved through the aftermath like witnesses who had accidentally become part of the cure. They carried archive keys, sealed testimonies, restored records, and enough enemies to make every docking request feel like a small gamble. Freedom, they had learned, was not a door. It was a route through unstable territory. Saelith had changed in ways that were harder to describe than victory. She no longer moved like someone bracing for ownership to return at any second. The old tension had not vanished, but it no longer ruled every gesture. She spoke before councils without lowering her eyes. She argued with governors, comforted the newly restored with a patience Jonah never would have guessed she possessed, and cut through noble excuses with a precision that left entire chambers silent. She had become something more dangerous than a survivor. She had become a person choosing her own shape in full view of a world that once tried to file her into legal death. Watching that was its own kind of awe. Jonah had changed too, though in a more human way. Awkwardly, stubbornly, and a little late. He had stopped trying to rescue every silence with words. He had learned that standing beside someone could matter more than deciding for them. He still argued with officials until they regretted being born, still treated polished cruelty like an insult begging for a reply, still threw himself into impossible situations with the terrible confidence of a man whose conscience had never learned moderation. But now there was more listening in him than before, more patience, more understanding that love, like justice, curdled the moment it became entitlement. They were above a dim border world when the question finally came to rest between them. The ship drifted on low burn, while outside the canopy the dark was pricked with strange new lights. Registry beacons were awakening far beyond old mapped jurisdictions, one after another, like stars remembering they had names. The restoration pulse from Veyra Prime had not stayed local. It had run outward through buried legal architecture older than any current house or trade empire. Dormant nodes were stirring. Sealed archives were opening. Lost claimant lines and forgotten populations across distant systems were beginning to answer. Jonah looked at the lights for a while before speaking. "Do you still hate that I bought you?" Saelith turned toward him, and there was no bitterness in her face now, only memory shaped into something steadier. "You never bought me," she said. "You interrupted the moment they tried to turn me into an object." The words settled softly, but they reached deeper than anything dramatic could have. Then she lifted her hand and touched the old bond mark at her wrist. It had faded since the cathedral, no longer burning with emergency law, only lingering as a remnant of a promise made under pressure. A shield, a scandal, a beginning neither of them would have chosen in that form if the world had been kinder. "This," she said, "was survival." Jonah nodded once. "I know, and survival is not the same as choice." "No." She held his gaze then, calm and certain in a way that made the whole ship feel still. "That is why I am choosing now." From a small case beside her seat, she drew a thin covenant band formed from restored archive crystal and simple ship metal from Jonah's own hauler, forged together during one of their long repair stops without his knowledge. It was not ornate. It was honest. Human pragmatism and alien memory made into one quiet thing. "I will not keep a bond that began in coercion," she said, "but I will make a new one if you will stand in it with me. No ownership, no rescue debt, no protected claim, only mutual vow." For once in his life, Jonah Vale had no clever answer. He only gave the truthful one. "Yes." She smiled then, small and real and entirely her own, and slid the band into his hand before fitting its twin around her own wrist. Not property, not emergency law, not fate pretending to be romance. A chosen union shaped after both of them had become free enough to mean it. Outside the canopy, more distant registry lights flickered on across the dark. Saelith followed his gaze back to the stars. "We were never the end of this story," she said. Jonah exhaled. "No, doesn't look like it." far beyond their route. Ancient systems were waking. Entire peoples might still be buried inside forgotten law, waiting for names to return, waiting for someone to interrupt the machinery that had turned survival into ownership. Beside him, by her own will and under no law but the one they had chosen together, Saelith rested her hand over his. Then she looked into the widening dark and spoke the truth that would carry them into whatever came next. Now, she said, we find out how many others are still waiting.